The luxury ballroom fell into hushed silence as 12-year-old Tommy Matthews stumbled forward clutching a silver laptop, his private school uniform wrinkled from hours of hiding in the venue's storage closet. His hands trembled as he looked up at his father James, whose face beamed with joy next to his stunning bride-to-be Catherine Morrison, the woman who had swept into their lives like a whirlwind of designer perfume and promises. Tommy felt his heart hammering against his chest as he glanced at his grandmother Martha sitting in the front row. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod, the same determined look she had worn when he first showed her the evidence 3 nights ago during their secret midnight meeting in her garden house. The weight of his discoveries pressed down on his young shoulders like a heavy winter coat in summer, making each step toward the altar feel like walking through deep water. The string quartet continued playing Pachelbel's canon, their elegant notes floating through the air like delicate soap bubbles about to burst. Tommy could see his little sister Emma, in her flower girl dress, her eyes wide with concern as she clutched their father's expensive laptop bag, where Shed helped him hide the evidence. Just minutes before the ceremony began, she was only 8, but she understood enough to know that something big was about to happen. Catherine stood radiant in her designer wedding gown that cost more than their annual property taxes, her smile perfect and practiced like everything else about her. Tommy remembered how Shed first appeared at their door 18 months ago, claiming to be a new client interested in his father's investment firm. Her story about being a Southern belle who inherited her grandfather's fortune had charmed everyone, especially his grieving father, who hadn't smiled properly since Tommy's mother passed away. The wedding planner hovered nervously at the edge of the gathered crowd, her clipboard hanging limply at her side as she watched Tommy approach the altar. 500 guests sat in perfect rows, their expressions a mix of confusion and anticipation. Tommy could see his father's business partners in the third row, the men who had unwittingly signed documents that Catherine had altered late at night in the home office when she thought everyone was asleep. His father's best man Richard Chen, a detective Sarah's brother, shifted uncomfortably beside James, as if sensing the impending disruption. Tommy had secretly contacted Sarah through Richard after discovering the first set of suspicious emails, but even he didn't know the full extent of what was about to be revealed. The laptop felt hot against Tommy's sweaty palms, containing megabytes of damning evidence that had gathered over 3 sleepless months of investigation. Catherine adjusted her veil, her diamond ring catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. Tommy remembered watching her try on that ring at Cartier, how Shed insisted on the most expensive one in the store, saying that nothing less would do for the new Mrs. James Matthews. But now Tommy knew that Shed already ordered a replica from a master forger, planning to switch them before she disappeared with his father's money. The wedding officiant cleared his throat, preparing to begin the ceremony. Tommy could see security guards discreetly positioning themselves around the room, following the plan had created with Detective Chen during their clandestine meeting at the public library last week. His grandmother had insisted on hiring extra security, though Shed told everyone it was because of the expensive wedding gifts piled high on the tables in the reception area. Tommy took one final step forward, his school shoes squeaking slightly against the polished marble floor. He caught a glimpse of himself in the giant mirrors that lined the ballroom walls. His mother's eyes stared back at him from his own reflection, giving him the final surge of courage he needed to speak up and save his father from making the biggest mistake of his life. The laptop screen flickered to life as he opened it, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, ready to expose the truth that would shatter this perfect day and bring a dangerous criminal to justice. Time seemed to freeze as Tommy connected his father's laptop to the giant projection screen, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he pulled up hidden folders. Catherine lunged forward, her perfectly manicured nails suddenly resembling claws. But she wasn't fast enough as the first email flashed across the screen, showing her real name, her criminal record, and a series of encrypted messages about offshore accounts worth millions. The gasp that swept through the ballroom sounded like a gust of winter wind as the first document appeared, showing Catherine's real identity, Sandra Patel, alongside a series of mugshots from police departments across 3 continents, her beautiful features twisted into something unrecognizable as she realized her carefully constructed facade was crumbling before her very eyes. Tommy could see his father's hands gripping the altar, his knuckles white as sheet after sheet of evidence illuminated the massive screen behind them. Detective Chen moved silently through the crowd, her plain clothes blending in with the wedding guests as she positioned herself closer to the altar while her team secured the exits. Tommy had practiced this moment countless times in his bedroom late at night, rehearsing every click and movement so he wouldn't fumble when it mattered most. His grandmother Martha stood up from her front row seat, her spine straight as steel, as she moved to stand protectively between Catherine and her grandson. The next document that filled the screen was a series of bank statements showing systematic transfers from his father's business accounts, each one cleverly disguised as charitable donations to foundations that Tommy had discovered were nothing more than empty shells Catherine had created using stolen identities from other victims. Emma clutched their father's laptop bag tighter as she watched her almost stepmother transform from a charming southern belle into a cornered predator, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor as she took another step toward Tommy. James Matthews' world tilted on its axis as he watched transaction after transaction appear before him, the numbers adding up to nearly $2 million. Catherine had already siphoned away, his voice caught in his throat as he recognized his own signature on documents had never seen before, forged with an expertise that spoke of years of practice. Tommy clicked through to a folder labeled Family Photos, revealing surveillance images of Catherine meeting with known criminals in airport lounges and empty parking garages, her appearance changing as often as the seasons. The wedding guests' conversations turned from confused whispers to outraged murmurs as Tommy revealed footage from their home's security cameras showing Catherine in his father's office at 3 in the morning, carefully photographing documents and sending them to untraceable email addresses. Richard Chen, the best man, stepped forward, his police training taking over as he noticed Catherine's hand sliding toward her designer clutch, which Tommy knew contained not just her phone but a second passport under yet another false identity. Catherine suddenly switched accents, her practiced southern drawl vanishing as she addressed the crowd in crisp British tones, claiming this was all a misunderstanding, a jealous child trying to ruin his father's happiness. But her words died in her throat as Tommy played an audio recording from last week, a conversation with her real brother in Mumbai, discussing how they'd disappear with the money after the wedding, leaving James Matthews and his children with nothing but debts and broken dreams. Detective Sarah Chen chose that moment to step out of the crowd, her badge glinting under the crystal chandeliers as she moved toward Catherine, who had begun calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Tommy could see the exact moment she realized she was trapped, her perfectly lined eyes darting between the armed officers now visible at every doorway, the damning evidence still streaming across the screen, and the faces of 500 witnesses who had just watched her entire criminal enterprise exposed by a 12-year-old boy who had refused to let his father become another victim in her long list of devastated lives. The laptop hummed softly as it continued displaying document after document, each one another nail in the coffin of Catherine's elaborate scheme. Tommy stood his ground despite his trembling hands, knowing that somewhere his mother was watching and that she would be proud of him for protecting their family from a predator who had almost succeeded in destroying everything they had built. Chaos erupted in the ballroom as security guards tackled Catherine, who had suddenly switched from speaking with a soft southern accent to barking orders in sharp British tones. James stood frozen at the altar, his face draining of color, as he watched his son's trembling hands reveal screenshot after screenshot of his company's systematically drained accounts hidden beneath layers of falsified spreadsheets. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floor as Catherine thrashed against the security teams, wore her designer wedding dress, ripping at the seams to reveal a slim device strapped to her thigh. Tommy recognized it as a satellite phone, the same one had seen her using in the garden at midnight when she thought everyone was asleep. Detective Chen quickly secured the device, while Catherine unleashed a stream of threats in multiple languages, her carefully crafted persona shattering like the champagne glasses that toppled from nearby tables in the commotion. James Matthews stumbled backward into the arms of his best man, rigid his legs, nearly giving out as the projection screen displayed a complex web of international bank transfers, each one showing how Catherine had manipulated his company's accounting system, the names of trusted charities morphing into numbered accounts in the Cayman Islands, Dubai, and Switzerland. Tommy watched his father age years in moments as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Their investment portfolio had spent 20 years building had been systematically gutted like a fish on a gold-plated hook. Emma broke away from her grandmother's protective grasp, running to her father with tears streaming down her face, her flower girl basket forgotten on the floor, spilling red rose petals that looked like drops of blood against the white marble. Tommy felt a surge of protective anger, seeing his little sister cry, remembering how Catherine had tried to convince their father to send Emma to a boarding school in Switzerland, a school that Tommy had discovered didn't actually exist, just another piece in her elaborate scheme to separate the family. Wedding guests surged forward and backward like waves in a storm, some rushing to James offering support, while others backed away from Catherine as if her criminality might be contagious. Tommy noticed three men in expensive suits quietly trying to slip out the side door, but Detective Chen's team was faster, cutting off their escape. Tommy recognized them from the surveillance photos, had discovered Catherine's real associates who had posed as wealthy clients to help her gain credibility in James' social circle. The wedding officiant's hands shook as he clutched his Bible, watching the holy ceremony he was about to perform transform into a crime scene. Catherine had even manipulated him, sharing tearful stories about her fictional past as a young widow who had found love again, while secretly using his respected position in the community to gain introductions to other wealthy families. Tommy had discovered she was planning to target next. His research folder, labeled Future Prospects, contained detailed files on 5 other recent widowers, all carefully selected for their vulnerable emotional states and substantial financial assets. Martha Matthews emerged from the chaos like an avenging angel, her silver hair gleaming as she approached Catherine with years of suppressed suspicion burning in her eyes. She'd never trusted her son's fiancée, but Catherine had been clever, isolating James from his mother by suggesting Martha was having memory problems, even recommending a retirement home that Tommy had discovered was connected to previous victims in Catherine's long string of cons. The facility would have given Catherine's team easy access to Martha's considerable estate while keeping her away from her family. Security guards struggled to maintain order as more evidence filled the screen. Tommy had organized everything meticulously, knowing he would only have one chance to expose the truth. A series of photos showed Catherine meeting with known members of an international fraud ring in various disguises, her talent for transformation evident in each image. James gripped the altar, his wedding ring clattering to the floor and rolling beneath the pew as his entire future unraveled before 500 witnesses who had come to celebrate his happiness but were now documenting his humiliation on their phones. Detective Sarah Chen spoke rapidly into her radio, coordinating with teams outside the venue where Tommy had told her Catherine had arranged getaway vehicles. His investigation had uncovered multiple escape routes and safe houses Catherine had prepared, proving this was no impulsive crime, but rather a carefully orchestrated operation designed to leave his father penniless and possibly facing criminal charges for financial irregularities that Catherine had committed in his name. Tommy felt his shoulders straighten with resolve as he clicked through to the final folder labeled Insurance. This was the evidence that would ensure Catherine could never harm another family again. Detective Sarah Chen burst through the ballroom doors with her tactical unit close behind, having been secretly alerted by Tommy the night before. She would later testify that in her 15 years on the force, she'd never seen a 12-year-old build such a meticulous case, complete with surveillance videos of late-night meetings and recorded conversations captured through his gaming headset. The elegant wedding venue transformed into a crime scene within minutes as Detective Chen coordinated her team's movements through a hidden earpiece. Tommy had provided detailed blueprints of the building, marking all possible escape routes. Head discovered them while combing through Catherine's encrypted emails, finding her carefully planned extraction strategy that included a helicopter waiting at a private airstrip 20 miles away. Officers were already speeding toward the location, silent to maintain the element of surprise. James Matthews watched in stunned silence as his son pulled up a recorded video showing Catherine in their home office at 3 a.m. methodically photographing documents from his personal safe. The combination Shed claimed to have forgotten multiple times, forcing James to open it for her. The footage showed her photographing not just financial records, but also his late wife's medical files, which Tommy had discovered she planned to use to create a false narrative about James' involvement in his first wife's death, a backup plan to destroy his reputation if the financial scheme failed. Detective Chen moved with practiced efficiency, her years of experience hunting white-collar criminals evident in how she directed her team to secure not just Catherine, but also 3 wedding guests Tommy had identified as her accomplices. They'd posed as distant cousins from Georgia, but their real identities showed connections to fraud operations across 4 continents. The guests gasped as officers removed elaborate disguises revealing faces that matched international wanted posters Tommy had discovered in his late-night research. Catherine continued her performance, struggling against the handcuffs as she pleaded with James in her fake southern accent. But Tommy wasn't finished. He played an audio recording from last week, captured through his gaming headset, which had hidden in the greenhouse. Catherine speaking in her real British accent, discussing with an unknown accomplice how Shed already transferred the first million to accounts in Dubai, and how James' complete financial ruin would be blamed on market manipulation and poor investment choices, ensuring she walked away clean. Emma clutched her father's hand as she watched her almost stepmother reveal her true nature. The little girl had been the first to notice something wrong when Catherine had asked her to practice copying her father's signature for thank you notes. Tommy remembered the day his sister had come to him worried about the strange request, his investigation starting from that moment of childhood intuition that had ultimately exposed an international criminal operation. Martha Matthews stepped forward, her voice steady as she explained to the shocked wedding guests how Shed worked with her grandson after he brought her his suspicions. They'd spent countless nights in her garden house reviewing evidence, Tommy gathering proof, while his grandmother used her social connections to quietly investigate Catherine's background, discovering that every reference, every story about her past was carefully fabricated to appeal to James' desire to give his children a complete family again. The tactical team seized laptops, phones, and tablets from Catherine's wedding party, identifying her support team who had been positioned throughout the venue ready to assist in her escape. Tommy revealed how Head discovered their communications using a signal interceptor Head built for his science fair project, repurposed to monitor the suspicious network traffic Head detected around their home. Detective Chen would later tell the press that it was the most sophisticated civilian investigation Shed ever encountered. James finally found his voice as he watched his future crumble before him, but instead of the devastation Catherine had planned, his words carried a father's pride as he hugged his son, recognizing that Tommy had not just saved their family's fortune, but had protected countless other potential victims. Tommy had found evidence of 5 other wealthy widowers Catherine had researched for future cons, each one selected for their vulnerability and isolation. Detective Chen secured the final piece of evidence as her team discovered a hidden compartment in Catherine's bridal bouquet containing a USB drive with what Tommy knew were her contingency plans, the flowers scattering across the marble floor like the pieces of James' shattered dreams. But beneath the destruction lay a foundation of truth that would eventually help their family rebuild stronger than before, based on love and trust, rather than the elaborate lies Catherine had woven around them like a poisoned web. The courtroom sat spellbound as Tommy took the witness stand 3 months later, his voice growing stronger as he described the moment he first grew suspicious when he caught Catherine teaching his little sister Emma how to forge their father's signature for school permission slips. What Catherine didn't know was that Emma had immediately told Tommy, believing it was wrong just as their late mother had taught them. District Attorney Sarah Martinez approached the witness stand, her heels clicking against the polished floor, as Tommy recounted how he'd started his investigation, setting up a hidden camera using his old smartphone in the hallway outside his father's home office. The grainy footage played on the courtroom screen showing Catherine sneaking in at odd hours when she thought everyone was asleep. Tommy explained how he'd noticed the office chair was always in a slightly different position every morning, despite Catherine claiming she never went in there. The jury leaned forward in their seats as Tommy described discovering the first red flag in his father's business accounts. Had been helping with the charity's website for a school project when he noticed discrepancies in the donation records. Catherine had created fake charitable foundations with names nearly identical to legitimate ones, the differences so subtle that even experienced accountants had missed them. But Tommy had caught it because one of the fake charities claimed to help the same rare disease that had taken his mother, a subject he knew everything about. Electronic evidence filled the screens as Tommy walked the court through his investigation. Had used his coding skills from Robotics Club to create a program that monitored network traffic in their home, catching Catherine sending encrypted emails at 3 a.m. His voice cracked slightly as he described watching through his bedroom window as she conducted late-night meetings in the garden house with people whose faces had later matched to international crime databases, the same people who had attended their engagement party posing as her college friends. Emma sat in the front row of the courtroom clutching their grandmother's hand as Tommy revealed how Catherine had planned to send her to a non-existent Swiss boarding school. Had discovered the school's website was created just 2 months before and traced the domain registration to a cyber cafe in Mumbai where Catherine's real brother operated. Tommy had followed the digital breadcrumbs, finding identical fake schools used in previous cons to separate wealthy widowers from their children. The courtroom fell silent as security footage showed Catherine changing disguises in airport bathrooms, switching accents as easily as she switched designer handbags. Tommy explained how had recognized her hand gestures and walking pattern despite her different appearances, had spent hours analyzing surveillance videos from previous cases, connecting her to unsolved fraud investigations across 3 continents. His late nights of research fueled by his determination to protect what remained of his family. Detective Chen sat behind the prosecution table, nodding as Tommy described how had reached out to law enforcement, showing them evidence had gathered through weeks of careful documentation. Had created a secure digital database tracking every suspicious transaction, phone call, and meeting, building an airtight case that would ensure Catherine could never harm another family. Photographs showed the elaborate network shared, created fake business cards, forged documents, and stolen identities, all carefully organized to withstand casual scrutiny, but falling apart under the determined investigation of a 12-year-old who refused to let his father become another statistic. Martha Matthews wiped tears from her eyes as Tommy described their late-night strategy sessions in her garden house, how she'd helped him piece together the psychological puzzle of Catherine's manipulation. She'd isolated James from his family and friends, while Tommy and his grandmother worked together, gathering evidence proving that her supposed wealthy background was as fake as her accent. The Southern Bill persona she'd crafted specifically to appeal to James' grief and his children's need for a mother figure. James Matthews watched his son with pride as Tommy explained how had protected their family business from complete ruin. Had discovered Catherine's plan to drain the accounts just after the wedding, leaving hundreds of employees without jobs and his father potentially facing criminal charges for financial irregularities she'd committed in his name. Tommy had documented every step of her scheme, creating backup copies of evidence, storing them securely with his grandmother and his father's best friend, ensuring that even if Catherine had discovered his investigation, she'd never be able to destroy all the proof. Gasps echoed through the courthouse as the prosecution revealed Catherine's true identity: Sandra Patel, the infamous Black Widow of Wall Street, responsible for defrauding 5 other wealthy widowers across the country. Tommy watched from beside his father as security footage showed Sandra changing disguises in airport bathrooms, switching accents in phone calls, and meeting with known members of an international crime syndicate. FBI Special Agent Marcus Rodriguez took the stand presenting a devastating timeline of Sandra's criminal career spanning 15 years and 3 continents. The evidence Tommy had gathered proved to be the missing link law enforcement had needed to connect dozens of unsolved cases. The agent explained how Sandra had refined her technique with each con creating increasingly elaborate false identities that could withstand standard background checks. Her latest persona, as Catherine Morrison, had been her masterpiece, complete with falsified Harvard degrees and manufactured social connections. Security footage from high-end hotels played silently on the courtroom screens, showing Sandra meeting with different accomplices, each one carefully selected to play a role in her cons. Tommy recognized several faces from their engagement party: the fake college roommate who'd tearfully toasted their friendship, the supposed business partner who'd vouched for her financial expertise, and the elderly couple who'd posed as her godparents, all of them revealed to be career criminals specializing in long-term confidence schemes. The prosecution presented financial records showing how Sandra had systematically targeted wealthy widowers with young children, her pattern becoming clear as Agent Rodriguez explained her methodology. She had studied grief counseling, becoming expert at identifying vulnerable moments when her victims would be most susceptible to her carefully crafted story of shared loss and renewed hope. Tommy remembered how she had first approached his father at a charity gala she had orchestrated specifically to meet him, having spent months researching their family's tragedy. Evidence recovered from Sandra's hidden laptop revealed detailed files on every member of the Matthews family, their habits, preferences, and vulnerabilities, carefully documented and exploited. Tommy saw his father flinch as emails displayed on the screen showed Sandra discussing him with her accomplices, referring to him as the perfect mark, grieving, isolated, and wealthy enough to make the long con worthwhile. She had even tracked his therapy appointments, timing her interactions to take advantage of his emotional state. Agent Rodriguez revealed how Sandra had built her network using a combination of blackmail and profit sharing. The prosecution played recorded conversations from her satellite phone showing how she had manipulated not just her victims but also her accomplices. Tommy had discovered these recordings, hidden in encrypted files, that Sandra had thought were unbreakable. But his late-night coding sessions had finally cracked her security protocols, exposing the full scope of her organization. The courtroom watched in shock as surveillance videos showed Sandra and her team conducting practice sessions, rehearsing different accents and scenarios. She had even created a mock-up of the Matthews home in a warehouse where she had practiced navigating the space before she had ever set foot in their lives. The level of preparation was staggering. Agent Rodriguez explained how she had spent over $50,000 creating her Catherine Morrison identity, purchasing everything from fake childhood photos to fabricated school records. Documentation seized from Sandra's multiple safe houses revealed she had already selected her next victims, a carefully curated list of wealthy widowers across the country. Tommy had found this list hidden in a password-protected file labeled Future Investments, each potential target researched with the same methodical precision she had used on his father. Their financial records, family dynamics, and emotional vulnerabilities analyzed and categorized for maximum exploitation. The jury visibly recoiled as Agent Rodriguez detailed how Sandra had manipulated other children in her previous cons, using them to gain their father's trust while simultaneously working to send them to boarding schools or distant relatives. Tommy felt a surge of pride knowing that his investigation had not only saved his own family but had also prevented other children from falling victim to her schemes. Had found evidence that she had already started inquiring about prestigious boarding schools for Emma, part of her standard procedure for isolating her victims from their support systems. James Matthews sat rigid in his seat as the full scope of Sandra's deception became clear. Agent Rodriguez presented evidence showing she had already begun transferring small amounts from the company accounts, testing the waters for larger thefts. while simultaneously gathering compromising information about James that she planned to use to deflect suspicion onto him. When the money finally disappeared, Tommy had discovered her plans to frame his father for embezzlement, ensuring that even if she was caught, James would be too devastated personally and professionally to pursue her. The prosecution's star witness Tommy Matthews returned to the stand for his second day of testimony, his school uniform replaced by a carefully pressed suit that made him look older than his 12 years, as he described the 3 months of meticulous investigation that had led to this moment. The courtroom fell silent as he explained how Head first noticed something wasn't right when Catherine began asking unusually detailed questions about his father's business during their family dinners. Tommy revealed how Head turned his gaming setup into a surveillance station, using his computer's secondary monitor to track network traffic in their home. While pretending to play online games, Head noticed strange data uploads happening in the middle of the night and traced them back to an encrypted server in Dubai, his voice steady as he explained how Head used his coding skills from Robotics Club to create a program that would alert him whenever large files were being transferred from their home network. Evidence photos flashed across the courtroom screens, showing the elaborate system Tommy had created using old smartphones as security cameras. Had positioned them strategically throughout the house, capturing Catherine in numerous compromising situations. The jury leaned forward as they watched footage of her practicing different accents in the guest bathroom, switching between her fake southern drawl and her natural British tone while making late-night calls to unknown accomplices. The tech expert hired by the prosecution confirmed the sophistication of Tommy's methods, explaining how the 12-year-old had managed to capture keylogged data from Catherine's laptop by modifying a wireless keyboard receiver. Had gotten the idea from a cybersecurity video explaining how hackers could steal passwords, but had used it to protect his family, instead discovering dozens of fake email accounts Catherine used to communicate with her criminal network. Detective Chen returned to the stand to collaborate Tommy's testimony, describing her amazement when the young boy had first contacted her through her brother Richard, showing her a detailed digital presentation about his suspicions. She'd never seen such thorough documentation from a civilian investigator. The evidence Head gathered had been so meticulously organized that her team had been able to immediately start surveillance on Catherine and her associates. Tommy explained how Head used his sister's innocent questions about their mother's old medical records to gain access to his father's home office. While Catherine was at her supposed yoga class, Head discovered that she'd been systematically photographing documents from the family's safe planning to use them as leverage if her schemes were discovered. Head carefully photographed everything back in its original position, creating a detailed log of what she'd accessed and when. The courtroom watched captivated as Tommy demonstrated how Head modified his bedroom baby monitor into a listening device, placing it in the garden house where Catherine often took private calls. Head recorded hours of conversations in multiple languages, working with Detective Chen to have them translated, revealing connections to criminal operations in London, Mumbai, and Hong Kong. His late-night research had uncovered a pattern of similar crimes spanning over a decade. Emma, now sitting beside their father, squeezed his hand as Tommy described how Head protected her from Catherine's manipulation. They'd created a secret code to communicate whenever Catherine was acting suspicious. Emma had become his eyes and ears during family outings, noting down every time Catherine spoke to strange men or disappeared for unexplained periods, while Tommy worked on breaking into her encrypted files at home. Financial forensics experts testified to the brilliance of Tommy's discovery of Catherine's money laundering scheme. Had noticed discrepancies in the charitable donation records while helping update the company website, tracking the funds through a complex network of shell companies that even experienced auditors had missed. His investigation had saved not just his father's company, but the retirement funds of hundreds of employees. Martha Matthews dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief as Tommy described their late-night strategy sessions in her garden house. Shed provided him with old photographs and society magazines, helping him trace Catherine's movements through various social circles under different names they discovered. She had previously posed as an Italian countess, a French art dealer, and a Russian ballet patron, each identity crafted to appeal to specific victims. The jury appeared visibly moved as Tommy explained his motivation, describing how the memory of his mother had driven him to protect what remained of his family. Had spent countless nights studying his mother's old medical records, proving that Catherine had been planning to use them to create a false narrative about his father's involvement in her death, a backup plan to destroy his reputation if her financial schemes were exposed. The prosecution presented recordings from Sandra's jail phone calls revealing connections to an international fraud ring that specialized in wedding cons. The defending attorney attempted to paint Tommy as a troubled child trying to sabotage his father's happiness, but the evidence was overwhelming as new revelations continued to shock the courtroom with their sophistication and scope. District Attorney Martinez played the most damning recordings, yet conversations between Sandra and her brother in Mumbai, discussing how they'd successfully pulled off similar cons across 3 continents. The siblings laughed about their victims, calling James Matthews their biggest score, yet planning how they'd celebrate in Dubai. After the wedding, "Sandy baby, you've outdone yourself this time," her brother had said. "Just remember to wipe the old man's accounts before the honeymoon." Her distinctive British accent, a far cry from her Southern Belle performance. The defense team squirmed in their seats as forensic accountants presented evidence of 27 other victims who'd lost everything to Sandra's various personas. Tommy had discovered the pattern while tracking her digital footprint, finding connections between seemingly unrelated cases of wealthy widowers being bankrupted by mysterious investment schemes. The prosecutors explained how Sandra had refined her technique, with each con learning from her mistakes until she believed she'd created the perfect crime. Security footage from high-end hotels across the world played on the courtroom screens, showing Sandra meeting with different members of her organization, each one now identified and under investigation. Tommy had traced their movements through financial records and social media posts, discovering how they'd created an elaborate network of fake references and background stories that could withstand casual scrutiny but fell apart under his determined investigation. Sandra sat at the defense table, her designer prison uniform a stark contrast to the wedding gown she'd worn 3 months ago, her carefully maintained mask cracking as the prosecution revealed how Tommy had found her real passport hidden inside a hollow book in their library, had discovered it while cataloging her personal belongings, finding multiple identities and credit cards, each one representing a different life she'd stolen. Evidence seized from Sandra's private storage unit revealed detailed files on potential future victims. Tommy had found the address hidden in encrypted emails she'd thought were secure. The jury gasped as photographs showed walls covered with surveillance photos and personal information about wealthy widowers across the country, each one carefully selected for their vulnerability and net worth. The prosecution explained how Sandra had been planning to expand her operation using the Matthews family wealth as seed money. Detective Chen testified about the international scope of the investigation, triggered by Tommy's evidence. Law enforcement agencies from London to Singapore had opened court cases involving similar schemes, the patterns matching Sandra's methodology perfectly. Financial records showed how she'd moved money through a complex web of offshore accounts, each transaction disguised as legitimate business dealings, but actually funding her next elaborate con. The defense lawyers' last desperate attempt to discredit Tommy backfired spectacularly, as they suggested his investigation was driven by jealousy of his father's new relationship. Tommy calmly presented his detailed research logs, showing how he'd discovered Sandra investigating his mother's death, looking for ways to use the tragedy against James if he ever became suspicious of her activities. The jury visibly recoiled as they saw Sandra's handwritten notes calculating how to maximize emotional manipulation of a grieving family. Emma testified briefly, describing how Catherine had tried to convince her to keep secrets from her father and brother, small things at first that grew increasingly significant. Tommy had taught her to play along while documenting everything in a diary that now served as evidence. The little girl's testimony destroying any remaining sympathy the jury might have had for the defendant. Her innocent observations revealing the calculated nature of Sandra's manipulation. Martha Matthews provided powerful testimony about how she had worked with Tommy to protect their family, explaining how she had recognized signs of manipulation from her years as a social worker but needed solid evidence before confronting her son. They'd worked together gathering proof while maintaining a careful facade of acceptance, watching as Sandra tried to isolate James from his support system, just as she'd done with her previous victims. Agent Rodriguez concluded the prosecution's case by revealing how Tommy's investigation had helped uncover a broader conspiracy involving corrupt banking officials, fake charities, and international money laundering. The scope of the criminal enterprise far exceeding their initial suspicions. Sandra had unknowingly led them to dozens of accomplices, her careful planning becoming the very evidence that would now dismantle her entire operation. Judge Eleanor Martinez delivered the verdict, finding Sandra guilty on all counts of fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. James hugged his son outside the courthouse, tears streaming down his face as he thanked Tommy for saving not just their family, but potentially other families from falling victim to the same scheme. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as reporters gathered to capture the moment that would make headlines across the globe. The judge had been particularly severe in her sentencing, citing the calculated nature of Sandra's crimes and her deliberate targeting of grieving families. 30 years without possibility of parole plus mandatory restitution to all identified victims. Sandra stood emotionless as the sentence was read, her perfectly maintained facade finally cracking when Judge Martinez specifically mentioned how a 12-year-old boy had accomplished what international law enforcement had failed to do for over a decade. Tommy stood between his father and grandmother as Detective Chen approached with unexpected news. The evidence he'd gathered had helped authorities recover nearly 60% of the stolen assets from Sandra's previous victims' funds that had been hidden in offshore accounts under layers of shell companies they'd never have found without his meticulous digital tracking. Chen explained how his investigation techniques would be used to train future fraud investigators at the FBI Academy. Emma rushed down the courthouse steps to join her family, clutching a familiar teddy bear, the same one she'd used to hide her diary documenting Catherine's suspicious behavior. Tommy wrapped an arm around his little sister, remembering how they'd worked together to protect their father, their bond stronger now than ever before. Martha watched her grandchildren with pride, knowing that their late mother would have been proud of how they'd protected their family legacy. James Matthews stood taller than he had in months, the weight of betrayal lifting as he watched Sandra being led away to begin her sentence. Had already begun the process of rebuilding both his company and his family's trust using the lessons Tommy had taught him about digital security and emotional manipulation. The business partners who'd gathered to support him through the trial now worked together, implementing new safeguards based on Tommy's discoveries. District Attorney Martinez approached the family holding a letter that had arrived from one of Sandra's previous victims, a wealthy widower from London who'd lost everything 5 years ago. Had read about the trial and wanted to thank Tommy personally for helping him finally understand how he'd been deceived. The man had attached photos of his own children, now able to return to their private schools thanks to the recovered funds. Reporters surrounded the courthouse steps, asking Tommy to explain his investigation methods, but the young boy simply smiled and credited his family. Their unity had been his strength through the long nights of surveillance and research. Had learned that real love wasn't about grand gestures or designer gifts, but about protecting the people who meant everything to you. His mother's framed photo waited on his desk at home, a reminder of why he'd never given up. Martha invited everyone back to her house for a celebration dinner in the same garden house where she'd helped Tommy gather evidence against Sandra. They'd transformed the space from a surveillance hub back into a peaceful retreat filled with flowers and family photos. James watched his mother and children together, remembering how Sandra had tried to convince him that Martha was becoming forgetful, when in reality she'd been one of the sharpest observers of Catherine's deception. Detective Chen made a special appearance at the dinner, revealing that Sandra's international crime network was unraveling as more victims came forward, inspired by Tommy's courage to share their stories. Shed brought a special commendation from the FBI, recognizing his exceptional service in bringing down one of the most sophisticated fraud operations they'd encountered. But Tommy seemed more interested in helping Emma with her science project than in accepting accolades. As the sun set over the garden, James found Tommy sitting in his mother's favorite spot beneath the old oak tree where Shed taught him about trust and integrity. Had carried those lessons through his investigation, never letting anger or revenge drive his actions, but instead focusing on protecting others from experiencing the same pain. Tomorrow, Head returned to being just another seventh grader, but today Head helped restore justice for dozens of families who'd lost hope of ever seeing it.